Welcome to Navigating Challenges in Collaborative Design and Change Management, Part 2, Rogers' Diffusion of Innovation Theory. Today we'll be walking through the introduction to the theory. We'll look at the four main elements of diffusion. We'll look at the attributes of the innovation that affect diffusion. We'll look at the decision-making process that people go through, the adopter categories, and how we might measure diffusion of innovation. By the end of the video today, you should be able to understand the fundamentals of diffusion of innovation. You'll understand the four main elements of diffusion. You recognize the attributes of innovation that influence the diffusion process. You'll be able to describe the stages that people go through in the innovation decision process, and you'll be able to figure out the difference between different adopter categories. What is diffusion of innovation? It is the process through which an innovation spreads within a social system over time. It involves the sharing of information that influences the behavior of individuals and groups, ultimately leading to the adoption and integration of new ideas, products, or practices across a population. The theory was developed by Everett Rogers in 1962, and it explains how, why, and at what rate new ideas, products, or practices spread within a population. There are four main elements of diffusion. Firstly, we have the innovation. Second, the communication channels, time, and the social system. The innovation is the idea, the practice, or the object that is perceived as new by an individual or group. The communication channels are the means through which information about the innovation is spread through the social system. Time refers to the duration it takes for an innovation to be adopted. It involves the innovation decision process, the rate of adoption, and the time that it takes for the innovation to reach different members of a social system. The social system is the network of individuals, groups, or communities of people among which the innovation spreads. There are 5 attributes of innovation that affect how it is diffused within a population. So the first is relative advantage. So what's good about it? This is the degree to which an innovation is perceived as better than the current solution. So the greater the perceived advantage, the faster the adoption. Second, we have compatibility. How consistent the innovation is with the values, experiences, and needs of potential adopters. Greater compatibility, the greater the likelihood of adoption. Complexity. How difficult the innovation is to understand and use. So the simpler, the easier to understand, the faster the adoption rate. Trialability. The extent to which the innovation can be tested on a limited basis. So innovations that can be trialed are more likely to be adopted. And observability. This is the degree to which the results of the innovation are visible to others. So when we can see the benefits or the impact of the innovation, the likelihood of adoption increases. It's important to know that the adoption of an innovation is not an instant decision. It's a series of steps that unfolds over time, and this is known as the innovation decision process. It is a 5-stage mental process that an individual goes through from first learning about an innovation to ultimately deciding whether or not they're going to adopt it or reject it. Firstly, the individual becomes aware of the innovation. They gain knowledge of how it works. Secondly, they are persuaded. So the individual forms favourable or unfavourable attitudes towards the innovation. Thirdly, they make a decision. So the individual engages in activities that lead to a choice to adopt or reject the innovation. Implementation. The individual puts the innovation into use. And finally, confirmation. The individual seeks reinforcement for the innovation decision that they have already made. Adopted categories classify members of a social system based on their level of innovativeness, reflecting how early they adopt new ideas relative to others in the system. Here we can see a normal distribution of adopted categories. The earliest adopters are the innovators. They are the first to propose and adopt an innovation. They are risk takers. They often have high levels of education and income, and they make up the first 2.5%. Secondly, we have the early adopters that make up the next 13.5%. They are the second fastest to adopt an innovation, and they often serve as role models or opinion leaders to the rest of the social system. Next, the early majority. So they represent the first mainstream adopters, and they tend to adopt an innovation after a moderate time delay. The late majority tend to adopt the innovation after the average member of the social system. They're a little more skeptical of change, so they tend to respond to economic necessity or social pressure. And finally, the last to adopt an innovation are the laggards. So they tend to be traditional, they might be very suspicious of change, or they might just have limited resources, and they're often isolated in the social system. When measuring diffusion of innovation, we need to consider the adoption rate. So this is the speed at which an innovation is adopted within a social system and is typically expressed as a percentage of adopters over time. So you can see here in the graph that we have, it typically follows an S-shaped curve. So it starts out quite slow with our early innovators and adopters, and then it reaches a period of acceleration until we reach a plateau. So that moment of acceleration where the adoption rate goes up is the tipping point. And critical mass occurs when enough individuals have adopted the innovation for further diffusion to become self-sustaining. So achieving critical mass is essential for long-term success. Make sure that the innovation continues to spread easily without needing as much promotion. We also need to think about the consequences of innovation. So, what happens when the innovation spreads? There are three general classifications that we need to think about. Firstly, the direct versus the indirect. So, what are the immediate results of the adoption? And what are the secondary effects? The anticipated versus the unanticipated. So, what did we expect? What did we plan for? And what were the things that were a bit of a surprise? Desirable versus undesirable. So what were the positive outcomes for adopters? And what were the undesirable consequences? Because these might lead to some negative impacts that could be harmful to individuals or groups. It's important that we plan for and review the consequences of innovation. Some key considerations to keep in mind when considering diffusion of innovation. So firstly, innovation attributes. Those with greater relative advantage, compatibility, trialability, observability, and less complexity will spread faster. Make sure that your opinion leaders, so key influencers, are involved early to drive credibility and wider acceptance. Communication channels. Identify effective formal and informal communication channels to control how your information spreads. This shapes adoption behavior. Always take time to understand the social system, so the norms, the structure, the decision-making processes, where the innovation is being introduced, because this will affect how the innovation spreads. Also take time to understand your adopted categories. They will have distinct characteristics, so you can then tailor strategies for each of those categories. Plan for varying adoption speeds across groups. So make sure there is flexibility in your adoption timeline. And reinvention, allow for and encourage adaptation of the innovation to fit local contexts and needs. Here are some additional resources for you to continue your learning. We've included the journal articles in your resources, but there is also a must-watch video, a TED Talk, How Great Leaders Inspire Action. Highly recommend you go look at that. Let's review the outcomes. So hopefully you will have an understanding of the fundamentals of diffusion of innovation theory. You'll identify and explain the four main elements. You'll recognize the attributes of innovation that affect the diffusion process. You can describe the stages of the innovation decision process. And hopefully you can also differentiate between various adopter categories. Time to reflect. So we have included a reflection activity along with a summary of all the information we've discussed in the slides. The reflection activity will ask you to think about how you might be able to apply diffusion of innovation theory to the work that you do. We've come to the end of today's video on navigating challenges in collaborative design and change management, part 2, Roger's diffusion of innovation theory. Look forward to seeing you for part 3.